I mean, with a pretty clear medical need, I mean, if the subject is medical cannabis, and if it is in fact useful as medicine, as the government asserts, then why not work to create the conditions where he can have access, safe access?
And also, going back to the economics of it, a lot of people are criticizing the government and the establishment in saying that marijuana is something that you can grow yourself. So there will be no need for a doctor. There will be basically very little expense if you can grow it yourself. And that this is something that the government would have trouble regulating, cannot regulate, simply because it's not a drug that you have to go to a manufacturer to get. It's a drug that you can produce yourself.
Well, it may have more trouble regulating because people can grow it themselves. But people can grow tomatoes themselves, and we still have food regulations.
Well, there to some people would be an appeal, saying this is something that the man, so to speak, cannot restrict me from or profit from or benefit from. They can't tax me for it if I'm growing it in my house. Right. I cannot be restricted, or I don't even have to go to any kind of authority figure in order to have this medicine, being a doctor, a government official, or a pharmacy, anything like that.
Right. So all that would be altered at that point would be if you grew your own marijuana, what would change would be you're standing before the law. Because if we have a legal regime that says medical cannabis is legal, recreational or non-medical cannabis is not legal, and you had cannabis, you would need to be able to demonstrate that you had a legitimate medical use. And the evidence, the form that's taken, at least in California, is if you have a note from your doctor recommending that you might benefit from cannabis.
And doctors have been charging for these notes. They've been charging patients for these notes various prices. I've heard anything from free to up to $150 or more for that. So there is a profit incentive for doctors. Again, I'm being the devil's advocate here.
Doctors have patients. They make money off of every patient, I presume. So I don't have any problem with doctors being in business, because that's in fact the business that they chose. And most of the people that I know went into medicine were very aware that because it's a tightly regulated market, that doctors are well compensated. So. I mean, that doctors are making money, I don't think that's news.
Right.
So that they are making money off of something else, that doesn't seem to me to be much news either.
Right. Well, as I'm saying, as we're going into this, I mean, every angle is being used to try to stop this from happening.
Right.
The government, the federal government, is going into states where the people have voted that marijuana should be legal for patients with a note from their doctor, and still arresting those people.
Right. It's very interesting that the California passed by initiative a medical marijuana law in 1996, I believe. Subsequently, the legislature came along and improved some of the problems with that initial legislation and with the initial ballot initiative, and passed legislation codifying the way that California would implement its medical cannabis. But that is there is still a conflict of whether state law takes precedence or whether federal law takes precedence, and where one jurisdiction ends and where the other begins. Because the justification for the Controlled Substances Act, the federal government's regulation, is about controlling interstate commerce. And you can read right in the preamble, we passed this law to control interstate commerce in drugs. So California is saying, well, medical dispensaries within the state for patients within the state is not interstate commerce, and the health and welfare of Californians is our purview, so it's not clear to us where one ends and one begins. And in June of 2005, the Supreme Court heard a case. So they ruled on a case in June 2005, saying that federal law enables the federal government, if it chooses, to come in and keep somebody from growing cannabis with legitimate medical use in their own garden, even though that's the law of California. What was interesting is that in response, Bill Lockyer, the Attorney General of California, issued an advisory to law enforcement in California saying, you work in California, for the government of California, your duty and obligation is to implement and enforce the laws of California. So we have, in some sense, a law enforcement priority question that, as they've done in Seattle, Washington, they've said marijuana is the lowest law enforcement priority, and they have a medical marijuana initiative, and so they're really calling off the dogs from the beat
on
cops,
the state level.
the beat cops, right, and then leaving it, saying to the federal government, look, you're saying here that it's medicine, and you're saying here that it isn't, and you're trying to make. You're saying that Marinol is a legitimate use of medicine, but that marijuana isn't, but they're the same thing. So you take care of that. You send your enforcement agents to take care of your issues. We'll take care of ours. In some sense is what's going on.
And, this creates a crisis for a citizen. I mean, when you have the state saying something is legal and the national government, the federal government, saying that it's not.
Right,
I mean,
right.
where am I supposed to go?
Well, it's like the old joke about the breathing law, that it's illegal to breathe, and so everybody is breaking the law at all times, and it then gives law enforcement discretion to be able to arrest anybody at will. And this isn't in medical marijuana, having this sort of gray zone or breathing law is not really any different than other industries that have gray interpretive laws where people don't know whether they're breaking the law or not. So, for instance, pornography can only be legal if it doesn't cater to a prurient interest in sex. But if it does, then it's illegal. And the actual words in the law are prurient interest in sex. So then you throw that to a jury that doesn't even know what prurient means. And, you never know. It's kind of each case by case, and that's, in some sense, you have the same uncertainty with the law, which is, for those of us who are classical liberals, we think that's very unfortunate because, well, stability and consistency and predictability in a legal system is very valuable for the functioning of a well-ordered society.
And so in there we have a little bit of a constitutional crisis, and who would think that something like marijuana would cause such a constitutional crisis, the battle between the federal government and the states,
right,
and who has jurisdiction. These were supposed to be issues that were already settled in the Constitution.
Right.
And the government seems to be, or the Supreme Court seems to me, make this nonsensical argument that somehow things within a state, happening within a state, used by patients within a state, is somehow interstate commerce.
Right, but this is not new. I mean, the first ruling by the Supreme Court on this very same subject that is exactly analogous is there was a farmer during the Depression and the New Deal who said, I think these price supports for corn are ridiculous, so I'm going to grow corn and feed it to my pigs, and I'm not selling it to anybody. There is no commerce here. I'm not subject to the federal regulations and controls. And he lost in the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court said, well, no, if you grow corn, you're going to affect everybody else, even if you're giving it to your pigs. And it's on that basis that the Supreme Court, that was the precedent the Supreme Court used in this medical cannabis case. If you look at the history of it, there's been a ratcheting from the American Revolution to today that the federal government has gotten more authority and control and power, and the states have waned consistently. The Civil War being the first major dislocation of state control, state authority, state power in exchange for federalization, centralization, big government. And that's continued since.
So do you think that's going to slow, or do you think that it's going to, what do you think is going to happen? I mean, what's your prediction? I mean, it's kind of like, this is like watching a soap opera. I've been watching this unfold, and I think Americans have been watching this unfold.
Right.
Where do you think this is going to go?
You look back at September 11th, and